It may already be too late in this new year to talk about New Year's resolutions. If you do make New Year's resolutions, I'd be interested to know how that's working for you so far. I hope it's working well and you're sticking to them, but we all know that New Year's resolutions can have a very brief shelf life. We make them with the best of intentions, but for some things we fall quickly back into old habits, or we realize that our lofty goals were just a bit too lofty to be practical. Now, we make New Year's resolutions because the changing of the calendar from one year to the next can feel like a moment to start fresh. It's not just another month, it's an entire year stretched out before us like a blank canvas with great potential and plenty of space to do something new, something different. And we almost always make resolutions because they have to do with something we've realized about ourselves that we would like to change. We feel out of shape, so we resolve to get fit. We want to expand our knowledge, so we resolve to read more on a topic or take a class. We want to be more responsible with money, so we resolve to spend less on things we don't really need and put more into savings. But there are other times of the year, too, when we resolve to do things in a new way, when we decide to mix up our lives on purpose, maybe just a little bit. And those are moments that are not always defined by the calendar, but by something in our heart that tells us we ought to take a chance. Or something has happened in our lives that makes us pause and reflect and wonder if we're on the right course and, well, maybe it's time for a change. I once had a neighbor who lived across the street from me. We got to know each other because it always seemed we were out working in our yards at the same time. So we would turn off our lawnmowers and meet in the middle of the street and just talk. His name was Bill, and he was about 10 years older than me. One day, Bill told me that he was turning 50, and it was kind of freaking him out. He said he did not view himself as a middle aged man, but here he was, 50 years old, and he found himself laying awake at night, replaying the tapes of all that he had done thus far in his life, his work, his family. He wondered aloud to me if he had spent all that time wisely, and he suspected, he said, that he'd wasted a lot of it on things that really didn't matter. Then he talked about being very aware of the ticking clock of his own mortality. For the first time in his life, Bill was thinking seriously about the legacy he would leave, and he wondered if maybe he should be doing something else with the rest of his life, something more significant. He didn't know what that would be, but something completely different that would make a mark to prove that his life had really mattered. He was looking for a cause for his life, for a sense of purpose, for a reason why. So he asked me for my advice, and all I could say at the time was, whatever you do, don't go out and buy a fancy sports car. That's not the answer. Never is. Because I recognized that what Bill was going through is what we so often call a midlife crisis. Although, I've never liked that phrase, as if reviewing and rethinking the meaning and purpose of your life is any kind of crisis. It's not. At, at least not unless you go out and buy a sports car. That conversation, though, affirmed a couple of things. One was you can have truly significant conversations anywhere, even in the middle of the street, in any typical neighborhood, any in any country. But I recognized in Bill something about myself and something that's very common with all of us, and that is we all arrive at moments when we see something in ourselves that we feel in our gut is lacking or that just needs to change. We all arrive at moments when we look back and wonder, like Bill did, what have I been doing all this time? Quite often we can judge ourselves too harshly, so if you ever do find yourself looking back and regretting anything, please remember the truth that worrying about the past is really wasted energy, because the past is not something you can ever get back. Now, you can and you should work to repair things that are broken, and you can resolve to learn from the past, but ultimately, the past is past, And the past has no business haunting your present or ever limiting your future. And we all arrive at moments when we seek out what we might be doing next. When you drive past a cemetery and the thought pops into your head that that could be your physical address someday. So, what are you going to do with your time between now and then? What will you resolve to do with the life you have left to live? No one can answer that for you with any specific details, but if I were to offer any advice, like I did with my neighbor Bill, it would be to pay careful attention to why you're thinking about what to do with that precious time. So, why not just keep on doing what you've been doing? Why make any changes or resolutions? You may be quite content with life and not be thinking these kinds of deep thoughts. The thing is, we all have a reason why we live the way we do. It's just that some people reach a point, like a birthday or the death of someone important to you, or a change in your job, or a health scare, or you see your child get married, or any number of life changing moments where you can find yourself at a tipping point, looking back in review and then also looking forward in contemplation, and you say, what now? But I think the better question, whether you've ever had those thoughts or not, is why now? Because if you can answer why, the what will make itself apparent. And what I mean by that is the why is our reason for the way we live our lives, our reason for being. And I believe it's really important for us to think about that and clarify that. Why are you the kind of person you are? I'm not talking about your occupation or how much money you have or your hobbies or your skill set. For instance, you could be an electrician or a banker or an office manager or an artist, or you could repair bicycles for a living. Doing any of those things could even be your passion. But that does not make you a person who seeks justice, loves mercy, or walks humbly with God. It doesn't mean that you do unto others as you would have done to yourself. Those are why things, moral guideposts, a way of being where our spiritual self is inseparable from and in harmony with our whole self. Now, ultimately, I think that's what my neighbor Bill was working out in his mind and heart. In that season of his life, with the dawning reality of middle age, he was coming face to face with asking himself why, and how he could synthesize that with what the rest of his life would look like. Again, I would not call that a midlife crisis, or a crisis of any kind. All Bill was doing was waking up and responding to his reason for being, his why. The Gospel of John tells us a story about a day, even down to the very hour, 4 o'clock in the afternoon, when two guys who had been disciples of John the Baptist saw Jesus walking past. And John points Jesus out to them and says, "There he goes, the Lamb of God." So the two men run to catch up to Jesus and ask him where he's staying. Jesus answers rather cryptically, "Come and see." So these two come along and hang out with Jesus for a while. One of them, named Andrew, goes to fetch his brother, whose name was Simon. Andrew tells Simon, "You've got to meet this man. He is the anointed one, the Messiah." Jesus takes one look at Simon and tells him, "Your name is now Peter, Petra, the rock." So what are we supposed to make of that story? Is it just John's way of telling us how the first disciples of Jesus were recruited? Yeah, in a way. But, of course, there's much more to it than that. It records a particular moment in time, down to the specific hour, when a few people were introduced or they reclaimed the why, the purpose of their lives. It was a tipping point for them, a moment they could always look back on when they resolved that nothing would ever be the same, because they had met a man who would open up a way of understanding themselves and how they would relate to everyone else in a new way. At the same time, it was a way that they already knew, but were not fully awakened to. It reached deep into their very spiritual center of knowing that they and everyone else belongs to the loving God of the universe. So, in Jesus, in his teachings and by his example, they discovered and they reclaimed their reason for being, their why. And that set the course for the way they would live the rest of their lives, for how they would understand their own value, meaning, and purpose, and how the natural outcome of that was to regard others as also worthy and beloved. Not that the rest of their lives was always easy. Truly loving your neighbor as yourself and insisting that God's spirit of love infuses all people everywhere, well, that can get you into trouble sometimes. Because it can be very countercultural to actually regard and treat everyone as valuable and beloved and welcomed. Because for those who insist that to belong to God and to live in God's love requires a test of obedience, or it requires following certain rules and regulations, and that some people are excluded from God's embrace, for those folks, your why for living doesn't always jibe with their understanding of how God lives in the world. But that's okay. The important thing is knowing yourself and trusting that at the core of who you are, your reason for being is to keep discovering the beating heart of God's love that lives within you and to see that love in others and point out that love and welcome and share that love in them. Let's live into our why, our reason for being, our meaning, our purpose. Let's resolve to do that this year and every day beyond. And every day, we will know more fully why we're here and what we're called to do the rest of our lives.